Here we have all of our panelists. Welcome to Queering the Tarot. I am the panel moderator today. I am Dr. Cyrano Patton. So lovely to see so many people in attendance, and I am just delighted to be among such creative artists, scholars, practitioners of tarot and astrology, and I'm excited about the conversation that I get to hear or facilitate today. So for those of you in the audience, we will be taking questions from people throughout and especially towards the end. So if you have questions, definitely hold on to those. You can share them in general chat. And at the end, I hope we will be able to have audio questions as well. So Britt, can you just verify that it works that way? Can people that's a bad sign. Can people in the audience share their microphones if and when they want? Okay. Well, we'll see. We'll go with it. Okay, so to start us off today, I would love to have a warm welcome for scholar, mystic, writer, Cybele Brandow. Please tell us more about yourself.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. My name is Sabella, as Cyrano mentioned. I use they, them pronouns, and I have been reading tarot for about, I guess, 20 to 25 years, depending on what qualifies as reading. I inherited my divinatory lineage from my great-grandmother, Hungarian woman who immigrated to this country during the World War era. And my first deck of tarot cards was given to me by my mother unconsciously. She was sort of possessed. That's the story, at least. She was possessed by my great-grandmother to give it to me. I was a student of religion in the academy for a little while, and I wrote my thesis on tarot. It was titled The Fool's Hermeneutic, toward a trilogic model for understanding authority in the confines of the tarot divination event. And that will be something that I hope to bring up at least once or twice in this context of how do we move into non-binary ways of reading tarot, of interpreting tarot. And now I am just recently retiring from running the main Jung Center here in Maine, the northeast corner and the eastern gate, and loved working with the Jungians. Lots of tarot people there, lots of binarists, and I am transitioning fully into writing children's nonsense literature, which is, of course, all about queers and non-binary and third gender. So I'm very excited to be here with you all today. And thank you, Cyrano, for facilitating this panel.
Yes, thank you so much. And next, we have our designer and illustrator from the Boston area. Another warm welcome here. Please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure thing. Hi, guys. My name is Lubanko. Pronouns are they, them. Let's see. I have been reading tarot for about 20 years, mostly in isolation, which I say because it's been really funny. So I published and finished a tarot deck and accompanying book in 2020, did a Kickstarter. It now exists. That's pretty cool. I have one because I just have to have it nearby for like product photos and stuff. But it's a very it's a very intense work. It's been a very intense work, and I definitely have been kind of more in the like sort of head down, very private practice aspect of tarot. And so sort of coming out of my shell in the last year or so as I show this deck to the public and kind of see how that is received has been really interesting. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk with y'all. I think I definitely have like it almost like I don't feel like I'm as educated in tarot as a lot of people. I've definitely had my own path that's been very almost like under a rock, under the earth. But I'm excited to talk with you all and see how that goes.
Thank you so much. So delighted to have you here. Of course, different contributions come in different channels. So I love that we're able to have people who have access to different pieces of the tarot story, as it were. And let's see. Next, I wanted to introduce somebody who I think is having some technical difficulties. But we have and will again, I believe, have Britt Orcutt with us on the panel. So Orcutt is an intuitive tarot reader, has been reading for over 20 years after receiving her first tarot deck in the 4th grade. She's read professionally for clients for the past 7 years, specializing in astrology and herbalism. Notably, she is a program coordinator for FlameCon and the founder West-based queer Comic Con Flaming River Con, named after the flaming Ohio River. In addition, she freelances as a training program creator and consultant on diversity and inclusion for businesses, and produces some queer programming for mainstream comic book as well. So looking forward to having her voice back in the picture. But for now, let's move forward to our Vietnamese American cartoonist, best known as the author of the graphic novel The Magic Fish, and known primarily as Trungles. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. I'm always really excited to talk about tarot. My name is Trung Le Nguyen, and I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. I am someone who came to tarot a little bit later. I kind of came to tarot right after I graduated from college from an illustrator's perspective because I am interested in the history of the printing press and I'm interested in the history of how images were disseminated, and tarot's popularity is absolutely like you can't separate it from the history of the printing press at all. And so I tend to like to pick apart images and figure out where they come from and kind of identify the parts of the tarot that kind of really speak to people in a very accessible way, and the parts of tarot that have sort of been subsumed by popular culture that kind of originally came from a very esoteric kind of cultural background. And so I love being able to chat with folks about what cards speak to them and what the imagery means to them and how they respond to different decks. I have created 3 completed tarot decks. I published a tarot deck called the Star Spinner Tarot in 2020. I think, right? 2020. It was either 2019 or 2020. Time is fake. And I continued to keep remixing and reformatting and redrawing different tarot decks, mostly because I really wanted to have a tarot deck that I could read with that I'd already drawn, and the Star Spinner had taken so long. And also, I'm just really interested in kind of parsing out imagery that would make more people feel welcome within kind of this very esoteric tradition of tarot. So thank you so much for having me.
So delighted to have you. Thank you so much. And so that, my queer fair audience, is our panel for the day. I selected some of these images to just give a brief taste, and I'm seeing some people say that the screen is very small for them, and if you'd like to take a moment to see the art in a larger format, you can click the icon at the top right corner of the art screen that has the little 4 arrows going out in different directions. That will give you a full screen option, but then you can reduce it afterward to see everybody's lovely faces. So I selected some of what I felt to be more like queer imagery, like that spoke to me. And an idea here that I would love to come back to is dragon as third gender. here there's this idea where we have a princess with a relationship with the dragon without the prince being involved in the picture at all. And of course, we can tell our own stories about art that might not necessarily be what the artist had in mind, but also we have a chance to talk to artists and illustrators today about some of their intents and their joys in this. So hold that thought. And I thought that we could start by looking at the Lubanko tarot. Just some of the art. I highly recommend doing a full-size screen share so that you can take a look at some of this. And I was hoping to get things started with a couple of questions for the panelists. Tell us about a time that you have queered tarot. Let's just start with the name of the panel here. Like, what has this meant to you?
I guess I can start if folks don't mind. So I find this question kind of funny just because there's no removing. So as an artist, right? Like I'm a queer person. Anything I make is coming from a queer person, and anything I make is coming from me and my limited, small, but aggressive, intense point of view, right? So there's no like separation of that person from the art for me when I'm making it. Once somebody receives that art, they're free to kind of do, interpret however they want and put their person into that and decide what it means to them. But when I'm engaging with the tarot, I'm engaging with it from the perspective of a queer person, from the perspective of somebody who doesn't necessarily play well with binaries. The other aspect of this question is that it's not necessarily just a queer thing for me, because for me, the entire idea of tarot, especially as someone who's made a deck, is looking at the frameworks and the way we tell stories around our society and what we frame as metaphors. So what do we frame as power? What do we frame as love? What gender are those things? Those are assumptions that a lot of different kind of cultures and societies, make depending on where you are from. Those assumptions are very different. So it's not about an absolutist framework of, well, the emperor is male and he's a white man with a big white beard, like a mad Santa Claus. Like it's not that absolutist. It's about, as an artist, questioning yourself and saying, like, if I see this metaphor in this way, what does that mean about me and my perspective? How do I push that? Or how do I own up to what that perspective is while acknowledging that it's coming from a fallible person? So when I was making my deck, I was thinking a lot about, where am I coming at this metaphor from? Like, what, am I going to depict a gender at all? Like the definition of gender also, as I have lived in the world, has changed about 12 times. I feel it will probably change about 12 more in the next how many years I live. And so then it becomes about almost making art that's beyond those words, so that somebody who doesn't speak your language, who doesn't necessarily even know where you're coming from, can look at that and have a sort of emotional conversation with themselves about the work without needing to use the same words that you do. So that's my big answer about queering tarot. Is it's complicated. It's everything.
That's fair. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Trung, do you want to go first, or shall I?
Sure. Well, yeah, I'll go first. I think I can dovetail from E's perspective as an artist as well. And I agree with everything that you just said, just very beautifully laid out, that like we can't help queering things when we interact with things, particularly narrative things and cultural things, as queer people, as queer artists, even queer readers. I think tarot, as we understand it, like I love to think about the Rider-Waite-Smith deck being sort of the popular tarot deck that we all know and understand. And loving the iconography from that space also means that you have to understand that it comes from a very Edwardian perspective, and it comes from a very particular iconography, and it comes from this kind of very strange sort of pith hat racist Egyptology, like Egyptomania sort of perspective as well. And so like I am someone who like I'm like a brown queer person, and so whenever I interact with images, I have to unpack the ways in which it's historically positioned itself in a way that's a violence to like other people of color. And so I have to, like, there's no space for me not to do that if I'm engaging with imagery and if I'm engaging with it with any kind of intention and compassion. And so queering, like, kind of as a process is pretty second nature to the ways that I think E and I approach image making. And that's something that it's like, it's not, I can't say that I don't think about it very hard, because we all overanalyze the imagery that we encounter. But I think in terms of the ways that we kind of queer the tarot, a lot of it tends to be in reaction to the very Edwardian perspective that a lot of tarot readers kind of come from. There's this romance in kind of folks who are interested in esotericism about like this imagined past that we kind of come from. That sense of history is something that's really strongly desirable, and that's just not something that most people would be able to find accessible. And so finding ways to bring tarot to people who don't consider it to be something that could be a part of their practice or a part of their storytelling is something that I'm really passionate about. And so I suppose like I'm not queering tarot in an academic sense, but I am doing it kind of in small ways in reaction to the assumptions that people have sort of made about it within esoteric spaces.
Mm-hmm. And I would argue big ways that may nonetheless feel small to you. But this is somebody from looking through the deck and from hearing people's responses to the deck and feeling that so many of their queer identities are represented. And Sabella.
Oh, okay. So I love what both of you are saying, E and Trung. I just totally resonate. And I feel moved to bring in, I think, an additional dimension here, because this came up in conversation earlier today with a professor friend of mine, as I was talking about the novel that is forthcoming of mine. And I said, so much of what I believe that I'm doing in the work that I do, in the art that I create, in the words that I craft, is about helping people remember how queer everything pretty much always has been. And so when I think about this question of queering, I have this like almost little resistance of, am I queering it, or am I just allowing people to see and inviting people to see what has been queer all along? I think sometimes about like Enheduanna, the perhaps the original writer that we know of, who scribed the descent of Inanna in Sumer. And as far as we can know, if you haven't read this story, I highly recommend it. It's definitely connected to tarot in lineage. And well, that's a lot of conviction. I would say I would identify some interesting threads here that connect it to then to Cybele and the Corybantes and the Sibyls and other divinatory traditions, which would have been in conversation with divinatory people birthing tarot into the world, or revealing tarot, whichever word you want to use. But in this story, there are tons of non-binary characters, and the scribe usually uses she, her pronouns, but the priestesses of Inanna were so often trans, what we would perhaps call trans today. And the priestesses of Cybele, or Sabella, my namesake, also often castrated themselves and started to wear different things and were speaking stories. So there's an intimate connection, I would say, between divinatory practitioners and artists and third gender or three gender or non-binary explorations of gender. There's something about the sacredness of the transition, the liminal space in gender identity and expression that puts one in direct contact, or perhaps more direct contact, or perhaps more direct memory of the sacred roots that we come from. And in my opinion, so much of when tarot is done best is when you step aside and you allow whatever needs to come through to come through. And when I have done this as much as I can, it gets really queer really fast. So I think that's the way I'll contribute here, is to just add a little bit of, are we queering or are we helping people remember what is queer all along and always has been?
I love this reframing, this idea of queering as reclaiming, as revealing, as illuminating. And while we're on the Lubanko tarot, I would love to just have some reactions, some discourse to how this topic, how our topic today, anything that you'd like to talk about today, plays itself out in any of these cards.
Are you talking about like us reacting to the specific cards that you're showing us, or like the Lubanko tarot, or just like the concept of the lovers throughout different tarot decks? I just want to make sure I'm understanding.
Yes, thank you so much. I was aiming for 2 of these 3 prompts. So in particular here, I'm showcasing the 8 of Swords, the Hanged Man, and the Lovers from the Lubanko tarot. And so if anybody just has an immediate kind of response or a read, a connection to these cards, I'm inviting that into the room. And then I was hoping that could also be a diving board for us to discuss if we have other thoughts about the Hanged Man, right? Even the title is gendered. Or the Lovers, which classically have been gendered, but not to give too much away before we move on to the Star Spinner deck, can really be re-envisioned or re-illuminated in new ways.
I mean, I can talk about my intent. I'm not sure what, yeah, I can kind of go from there. I mean, so this deck was kind of funny, right? Because it's not just it's not just about like a personal set of metaphors and a personal set of mythos and kind of putting my foot down in certain ways about being like, no, I'm going to take this, this thing about lovers and make it sort of, I'm not even going to use the term non-binary, because that's not a term that I knew about when I had these, you know, sort of feelings of strangeness or apartness when I was much younger. But just sort of like a different gender experience, perhaps. So, you know, the other factor is that I wanted to make a deck that was sexy. I wanted to make a deck that was intense. I wanted to make a deck that was on fire, artistically, emotionally, and otherwise. And so a lot of this work is charged on purpose in that way. I think the Lovers card is the one that I get the most direct feedback on from people. I would say aggressively direct. I would say displeased is another word, because people are asking, you know, how could you take this card and make it so aggressive? And, you know, I say as an art, you know, when I'm making this particular deck, I think a lot of people come at tarot different ways, and especially a lot of deck makers come at tarot different ways. I'm not just making a tool, I'm making a series of paintings that comes directly from me. And so I'm admitting, like, you know, up front, like, this is my perspective. It is small and it is for me, but it is, and it is going to be intense. So it is not for everyone. Some people are going to look at this and go, look, that's just too much for me. But for me, I think that in the place of the sort of overall tarot, like kind of major arcana trajectory, where it's almost about this sort of like maturation of perspective and slowly taking in the metaphors of the world until you have your own kind of building blocks to tell your story, right? when you get to the lovers, when I think about first loves and first concept of love, it is terrifying. The way that the world tells love as I understand it and as I experienced it as a young person was very frightening. It was very rooted in predator prey uh, sort of dynamics. There's the male and the female, and one chases the other, and violence happens. Um, that's insane. And there are a lot of narratives about love that are insane. And there are also a lot of intense feelings that can feel insane. And so rather than kind of being another voice softening that, I wanted to take all of that high intensity feelings of terror and love and feeling so consumed by someone that you literally want to burrow it, like just bury yourself in their chest and throw it all on the same card. And I understand that that's a lot, but that is what it can be like. And the more we muffle these feelings, the more that we don't talk about it, the more that we censor ourselves. And we are all going to die. I will die someday, and I'm not spending time on this earth making art that apologized for itself. So that's sort of where I come at with this. The Hanged Man is one of my favorite cards because it was one of the first cards I made. I made it. I drew it in ink, and then I decided I wanted him to have a shirt, but I wanted to see everything. Um, it's not that complicated. I just wanted to see it. And then the Eight of Swords, I love a good spicy melodrama. I mean, just like, oh, I'm in pain, but I brought an outfit for the pain also, and I'm dying, but there's a set design, and I've carefully lit my dying, and I've made a playlist on my MySpace about how much I'm dying and how much I hate it. This is very much I've had a lot of people say, like, this deck is good for shadow work. And it's like, yes, it's also good if you are prone to emotional temper tantrums. It's very helpful for that. So I don't know if that answers your question, but those are those are some perspectives on those cards. And if you read with these cards and you're like, I don't get it at all, that rules, roll with it. That's just how it is.
Did anybody else have any reactions? Sabella, I was hoping, but feel free to punt, I was hoping that you might comment on the idea of consumption as tied into love or romance. There's a literalization of the consuming of the loved one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm happy to talk just a little bit about this. First of all, this is my first time looking at this deck, and I love it. It's so spicy, and it's beautiful that the Eight of Swords is showed, because this is usually the card that I go right to in a deck, and it's how I sort of like go visit with the tarot reader, and I'm like, okay, so what are you bringing? Like, what are you bringing to the table? And this is such a unique Eight of Swords to me. And it brings to mind so much of my like queer relational dynamics and the like high femme camp antics, and just being like, spank me, don't spank me. I don't want that. Stop talking, talk to me again. And Eight of Swords is this like trap of our own design, and this person is eating it up. I mean, getting into consumption, right? Are they consuming themselves, or are they inviting consumption? How much of it is inanimate? So delightful. And I suppose just a little bit on consumption. I think about consumption a lot because I've been working on this model for gender that has sexual metaphor as secondary and takes consumption as primary metaphor, because I was looking for a triadic embodied metaphor system that children could access intuitively. And because we're not out of the womb needing to recreate immediately, so sex is not a very accessible way, and it falls into binaries so quickly in gender metaphor land. But there are three consumptions that we have as humans that if we don't consume regularly, we die. And this is something I think about a lot with gender, where all of us have all of it. We have the whole soup of gender in us. And breathing, eating, drinking, 3 minutes, 3 days, 3 weeks without one or the other. And then when we think about intimacy and how consummation metaphors, consuming, these start to apply to sex very quickly. And we can see how gender sort of moves through all of this. And so I am always happy to see artists who play with consumption, because I think this is the key for understanding human condition. Because if we even go a whole day without eating, drinking, or breathing, we're done. We have to consume. We have to consume to be alive. It's the most innate alchemical function, I think, of our incarnated life. And I don't want to take up too much time going into this triadic model, but I just wanted to sort of plant that seed for people to start ruminating and thinking about how gender as consumption can be applied. So thank you, E, for your wonderful work.
Yes, thank you. So in the interest of time, I think I will move on to our next deck. So here we have Trungle's Star Spinner Tarot. And I made a little note before that we might see some additional re-illuminations of lovers here. And again, just a select number of cards highlighted and called in. And I would again like to welcome people's responses, visceral, idealistic, or otherwise.
Thoughts, but I want to make sure they have time to talk about their work first. I don't want to steal that thunder.
Should I start, or do you want to start?
I mean, I can start with my response, and then I'd love to hear what you have to say about your own work.
Sure.
Mine will be pretty short.
Okay.
When I see this deck, it makes me wish I'd had it when I was younger. It's just such a soul warmer of a piece of work to me. Just looking at the colors and the people that are there, it makes me feel like, God, this is so sappy. It makes me feel like I want to like embrace the world. Like, I don't know how else to put it. I just look at this and I feel welcomed into a larger world in a way that doesn't feel sanitized, but feels kind. And I think that's something that I really look for in a lot of work these days, because there is a lot of sanitization of queer voices that just grinds my bones into dust, man. But I think there is such a beauty and a care to this work that shines and also invites. And I think there's often this like kind of battle between inviting versus sanitizing, especially when we as queers and people who are basically not kind of what I would call the like mainstream white guy voice, you have to be so careful with how you present your work and sort of scaring people away. And like, are you sanitizing or are you inviting? Like, this is inviting. And I just it really, when I look at the work from this deck, there's always something new to find. There's always something inviting you in to learn more. It's kind of one of those things where it's work that I feel like I could give anyone, and that's a compliment because it has so much depth to it. And it has so much invitation. And also I am obsessed, like as someone who loves to ink, I am obsessed with how beautiful and lyrical that line flow is. So I'll stop gushing.
Oh, thank you so much, Amy. I'm like getting emotional. I'm like, oh no,
I love this deck.
All these people.
Those are my feelings.
Oh, thank you so much. I actually, since we looked at your deck first, I had been ruminating on some thoughts about like kind of the nature of our two decks, and how they seem really polarized, like aesthetically, but I think they come from very similar places. In that I really admire the Lubanko deck and kind of seeing it come to life, like on my Twitter feed, slowly over time. And the images come from this space of visceral honesty that is really kind of rare to find in imagery, where it really doesn't apologize for a lot of things. And so in that way, it's very accessible because it feels honest, like from your blood and from your core. And that's something that I was kind of trying to do in my own way with this deck as well, where I'm trying to make a deck that is really warm and welcoming. But my personality as an artist is a little bit different. Like I'm a little bit more like I have a stiff upper lip and I'm like very like I tend to like to keep things at arm's length. But the ways that I tend to like to make imagery that is a little bit more accessible is to um, do something that I think reminds me a little bit of what Sabella was talking about before, where queerness has always existed. It's always been there. And I'm someone who likes to study images from a long time ago. And so I do a lot of excavating queerness from sanitized narratives and finding places where violence exists and where, you know, desire exists and horror and all of those things that have sort of been um, almost reduced and infantilized to sort of children's stories, but all of those elements have always been there within kind of folklore and fairy tale literature, which is something that I explore in a lot of my imagery as well. So on its face, it does look very kind of like sugary, and I love that that's something that people respond to in a really positive way. And I am always really happy to hear that folks are able to kind of unearth more about them and kind of like find this sort of shadow side of this particular deck as well.
Oh, this deck is amazing. Have you studied Willy Pogánya's illustrations, famous Hungarian illustrator? Oh my gosh, I just so strongly resonate with this style. I collect old fairy tale books during the sort of quote unquote golden age of illustration, and there is so much of the like nouveau style here that just flows lyrically, and it is so fairy tale and so mythological, and the accessibility of it is amazing. And I think, as E said, that's a compliment. I think when I first started making art and writing, I was trying to make it as inaccessible as possible because I thought that was what the cool kids did. And I've realized more and more that it's really all about accessibility. Can you transmit the medicine in a way that's accessible to so many people, that people can have this communion experience with your imagery, with your stories and your metaphors? And these images feel so familiar, like I have seen them before. Like they drop me right into the collective imagination of this world. And I'm seeing Kali, I'm seeing Thersis, I'm seeing Dionysus, I'm seeing the Snow Maiden. I'm seeing so many stories here, and it's just lighting me up, or shedding shadows on like beautiful flakes of it all in my psyche. So I'm just so grateful for you bringing this. I love your style so much. Um, the lovers, the coyness of it is just so powerful. There's so many ways you can play with it.
I love also the I'm not sure exactly how to say it, like the gender, it's not quite ambiguity, but like an open palette where the gender in this card could kind of be anything. And I switched up some of the side cards because I wanted to return to this idea that I've become obsessed with. The dragon is the third gender. And here we have the King of Chalices as a dragon. And I'm curious if there's a story to this for you, Trung, or if there are other kind of reactions or ideas to this. Because sometimes we're taking humanoid characters and we're showing, you know, expansive genders that we might not see in classical decks. And then there's also the movement into other creatures, other species, even, that to me has always had a very gender expansive feel.
Well, all of the kings in the Star Spinner deck are allegorical animals. I didn't want to draw more kind of like human paternal figures than there needed to be in the deck, and so I made sure that all the queens were figures and all of the kings were animals of some kind. And the King of Chalices is one of my favorites because in kind of like mythology where I come from, dragons are not kind of like these big scary things. They're sort of like spirits that bring water and that inhabit things that bring sustenance. And so it was kind of sort of like a perfect metaphor where it sort of was a symbol that I was really familiar with and I wanted to put into the deck to make me feel welcome in my own work, which is something that I think a lot of like queer creators struggle with when they first start. Like this deck was something that it was my first tarot deck project and it was done over 4 or 5 years. And so it was a very long process where I was just taking my time. And so the ways that I think about a lot of the imagery has sort of evolved. And I don't want to get into an editorial place where I would, you know, have regrets or like want to do things differently. But one of the surer choices that I made was to kind of turn Western esoteric iconography on its head, where a lot of feminine figures are allegorical and they don't have any agency of their own. They represent something else. And I didn't want that to be the case in this deck. And so I sort of thought a little bit harder about how I wanted things to be represented when the notions that are associated with particular cards are gendered in a lot of readings of it. So that's kind of why the kings are the way that they are.
Mm-hmm. And also, I'm seeing the time. I'm seeing what I imagine to be about a 12-minute warning for us. So people can still feel free to kind of speak to what they want to speak to. I'll bring up the next question that I think the title, the Star Spinner deck, really invites us into, which is, in what ways do people experience tarot and astrology as connected? And maybe even what do our queer and non-binary frameworks have to offer all types of divination from tarot astrology onward?
Because mine's kind of short. For me, it doesn't. It's not related to me at all. I have no, like, so I'm going to separate this into kind of like personal practice and use of my work, right? Because I've made a tool that a lot of people who practice astrology feel very strongly about, and they have that as part of their personal practice. For my personal practice, there is no astrology entering into it. I also recognize that a lot of people, like, you know, I also recognize that the history of tarot has a lot of astrology tied into it. There's so much of that kind of method of storytelling and divination and just history, right? It's a very big weight of history of how people talk about these themes, how people talk about time and the cosmos, right? It's all, it's got a certain weight to it that's very intense. For me personally, I think about it strictly from a storytelling perspective and strictly from a historical perspective and how I'm using those kind of modalities to better transmit the metaphor that I'm trying to communicate. In my personal practice, I am extremely astrology free. I recognize its place in kind of the queer community as, you know, a billion things to a billion different people, right? Like every method of divination is going to have a billion meanings to every person that kind of comes across it. And it's not just divination. There's, you know, so many ways that people use it. I personally stay, you know, I would say that I have a wariness towards a method of divination that assumes any sort of arbitrary traits by birth. I just, as a queer person, quite frankly, as someone who overlaps a couple of other identities that I don't really want to go into right now, like, I'm wary of the foothold that it has in queer spaces. So I challenge that question because of oftentimes I think the simplicity that I see it applied in a lot of queer spaces that I inhabit now. I think it's something that we as queer people and we as people need to examine very closely in how it can get simplified and how it can become dangerous. Because these stories are very beautiful, you know, these stories can be very beautiful. And one of my friends who is a very, very, like, I would say not devout, but has a very strong astrology practice, does this really beautiful thing that I love, that when they talk to me about astrology and when they're talking to me about things like my chart and stuff, where I'm like, okay, they ask the question, you know, does this resonate with you? If not, how do you want to talk about it? And I just think that's such a smart and open and welcoming way to do that. So my kind of personal standpoint is to reject like absolutes imposed on by old stories and challenge them at every turn. So that is kind of where I come at from it. You know, I'm looking at these stories, I'm looking at these metaphors, and I'm looking at these modalities, but I'm never just saying, oh, this is it. Scorpio likes butts. This is it. Like, you know.
Sure, yeah.
As
Thank
a
you so much
Scorpio
for
also. Like that's that's the number one thing I get is people going, oh, of course you're a Scorpion. It's like, it means nothing to me, but have fun. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you for holding that side of it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And I know there's gonna be a range, and that is okay. Like respect, but that's where I'm at.
No, I love and value a challenge to a question. Yeah.
I'm happy to amplify what you just said, E, and share, I guess, my perspective on this, which is also some wariness. And what my thesis went through 500 years of manuals and writing on tarot, and there were so many where men, primarily men, decided which sign or which moon or which astrological body corresponded or correlated to which tarot card. And what I found was that none of them really agreed with each other. And so I looked at this and I was like, is this just some strange projection exercise? Like you're just projecting something of your own. Now, it could be said, is any divination not projection? That's a good question. But if there is a state of divinatory ecstasy where one is able to step aside and allow some sort of divine source to come through, my preference is to keep it as simple as possible and keep it to the image. Now, the only exception I have to this in my own practice is when a deck specifically brings an astrological image or symbol into it and says, think about like Taurus for this card. And then I will bring that in. But if the card and if the artist doesn't intentionally bring astrology in, I don't bring it in. I might say, do you know that in mid-February, Pluto returns, it goes exact. And so there might be some aspect in this reading of the greater, collective rebirth that is going on in this land. So I might do that, but I'm very hesitant to say, oh, the Eight of Swords is connected to Gemini, because I'm not even sure. I think that just makes things less accessible, in my opinion. But I will say that I think learning how to read imaginally and learning how to interact with symbols is helpful for any divinatory system. And you can start with tarot, you can start with, whatever one is part of your lineage or your ancestral practice. You can try to connect it, you can try to mine back and follow the footsteps. but so many of them are just, how can we cultivate this romance with unconscious? How can we cultivate the romance with spirit? And try to receive whatever help or assistance or guidance is necessary to facilitate our own transformations in this life. So thank you for the question, though.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let's try to squeeze out the last 5 minutes that we can with any questions from audience members. It might be easiest to type them into the chat, but if you do have microphone access, you're welcome to try using that. Some gratitude coming out. Yeah, I've just been so grateful and honored to be here and to be a part of this and to hear this excavation of tarot. How often do people do readings on themselves? Is a question from the audience. Any cards you're in love with from other decks that you wish were designed differently?
No.
I read for myself about once a week. I kind of like it as a storytelling practice because I love envisioning tarot as a dynamic, like choose your own adventure story that you facilitate with this like deck. Because I think of decks as being books, just with pages that are sort of free, and so I like to do that. One queer deck that I really wanted to shout out that we haven't talked about is the Fat Folks Tarot deck. Is out now, I believe, and it's incredible. It has a lot of really beautiful images from a lot of different artists. It's a bit of a community project that was organized by an artist by the name of Ruby from Brooklyn, I believe. But yeah, Fat Folks Tarot is really, really great, and it was a deck that I wish that I had encountered earlier in my like facilitating my relationship with the tarot and its imagery.
Let's see. I'm looking at the questions here. Do I do readings on myself all the time? There was a little bit of a break, like after like the Kickstarter got funded, and I like just sort of left my body for a while. And then after my store went live, I just like couldn't look at tarot for a while. I just couldn't do it. But in general, tarot has been almost an entirely solitary practice for me. I read for myself mostly as a way to check in. And kind of challenge any assumptions I have about something. So one of the readings I do pretty regularly is a 3-card spread, which is where I was, where I am, and where I might end up. So it's about like kind of pulling out specific themes and saying like, hey, here's a theme I probably focused on in the past or that I should examine about my past. Here's a theme that I should focus on in the now. And here's something that might come up in the future just because if it comes out of my head, it'll probably come up. So that's how I tend to focus. As far as like any cards that I wish I'd done differently, no, I have no regrets. I made this. The reason this deck took me 7 years is because I spent all that time writing the book and making the paintings and deciding I will simply have no regrets. I have many other jobs. I have many other things to do. But in this deck, I will have no regrets. And so as my style evolves, that's fine. I may end up doing totally different things. But for this specific unit of time and unit of work, no regrets.
We also had a question about tarot divination as Romani cultural appropriation. I wonder if Sabella, based on your Hungarian divinatory heritage, you might be able to speak to that.
Yeah, such an interesting question and an interesting topic. I think where I lean as somebody with Magyar and Roma lineage when my great-grandmother was passing on the lineage to me, um, which was kind of a strange queerness in itself because it's only supposed to manifest in women, in girl children, but it manifested in me based on my eye color or the silver specks in my eyes. I can't remember exactly what it was, but she never told me that other people couldn't use it. Of course, I do respect people of the Roma community who ask that, you know, their particular form of tarot divination or cartomancy not be mocked or replicated in a disrespectful way. But I also have many Roma friends who are open to respectful engagement with tarot. um, I think so much of what feels appropriative is when people get dressed like a gypsy and they put on their coins and they have their crystal ball and they, you know, they try to do this fortune telling trick, or they, um, you know, they adopt some of the like kind of deeply inappropriate and violent imagery to extort money from certain people in a state of spiritual emergency or emotional crisis. I do think that's inappropriate. But also from my research in scholarship on tarot, it's really tricky to trace where this deck and where these images come from. And it's interesting, kind of in tarot history community, basically the question has been given up because so many people have devoted their entire lives trying to find the answer to this. And the best they've come up with is like 25 different possible answers and more all the time. So I think with this, as with other things, if you're worried, um, be respectful and listen to spirit, and always go to your lineage first. Every lineage has a divinatory practice. And if you don't know what it is, pray to your ancestors, and they might, you know, they're often receptive and may give you a sign. Um, so thank you for that question.
Thank you again to all of the panelists. Thank you to our audience for being present today. I hope that this has been a nurturing process to our connection with tarot, or maybe inspired us to go and get some more magical tarot decks in our lives. And we will kindly give way to the next talk. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
With so much love to you all. Thank you, Cyrano. Thank you, E and Trung. It's wonderful meeting you.
Thank you, everyone.